The mahogany table and conference room 4B felt like an ice flow. Elena, 36, sat perfectly still, her hands folded over a leather-bound folder that contained the last 3 years of her life's work. Across from her, Julian, 42, leaned back in his chair with a casual, predatory grace that suggested he'd already won a war she hadn't realized they were fighting. The new chief operating officer sat between them, looking everywhere but at Elena's eyes. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood, his wedding ring catching the overhead fluorescent light, the same ring Elena had helped him pick out 6 years ago. It wasn't a divorce decree. It was a termination of her contract, effective immediately, citing a morality clause she had never seen in her original employment agreement. "It's about the optics, Elena," Julian said, his voice as smooth as expensive bourbon. "The board can't have a head of development whose personal life is complicated. It reflects poorly on the firm's stability." He didn't mention that the complication was the fact that he had moved his 24-year-old assistant into their shared brownstone 3 days after Elena moved out. He didn't mention that he had spent the last month quietly rewriting the company's internal bylaws to ensure her equity wouldn't vest if she was fired for cause. He just looked at her with a pity that felt like a physical blow to the chest. Elena didn't argue. She didn't cry. She realized in that moment that Julian hadn't just ended their marriage. He was attempting to erase her professional existence. He expected her to beg, or perhaps to scream, but she simply took the paper, stood up, and walked out of the room without a single word. "Welcome to the channel. I'm glad you're here to witness how a single, calculated moment can shift the scales of power entirely." Before we go any further into Elena's journey from the brink of ruin to a position of absolute leverage, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. It helps us bring more of these grounded, high-stakes stories to you. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your city or state in the comments below. Now, let's look at the choice Elena made that morning. A choice that would eventually destroy everything Julian thought he had built. Elena walked through the glass-walled lobby of the firm she had helped build from a boutique agency into a regional powerhouse. Every face she passed was a study in feigned busyness. They knew. In the world of high-stakes corporate architecture, secrets traveled faster than light. By the time she reached the curb, her keycard had already been deactivated. She stood on the sidewalk of downtown Chicago, the wind whipping her coat, and felt a strange, cold clarity. Julian thought he had stripped her of her status, her income, and her dignity in one fell swoop. He assumed she would retreat to a quiet apartment, lick her wounds, and eventually settle for whatever pittance his lawyers offered in the divorce. What Julian had forgotten was that while he was out playing the part of the visionary CEO, Elena was the one who managed the foundations, both of their buildings and their legal entities. She hailed a taxi and gave an address that wasn't her temporary rental. Instead, she headed toward a quiet, unassuming office building in the West Loop. This was the workspace of Arthur Vance, a man who had been her father's legal counsel for 30 years and a man Julian despised for being old-fashioned. Arthur didn't care about optics. He cared about the fine print. As the city blurred past the window, Elena opened her folder. Tucked behind her termination notice was a document Julian had signed years ago during the frantic, sleep-deprived days of their first major series of funding round. It was a secondary indemnification agreement, a boring piece of boilerplate text that Julian had skimmed and signed while distracted by a phone call. He had always been the big-picture man, leaving the tedious details to Elena. That was his first mistake. Arthur was waiting for her with a pot of Earl Grey and a look of grim determination. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply laid out a map of the corporate structure Julian had spent the last year trying to obscure. He's been moving assets into a holding company registered in his brother's name, Arthur explained, tapping a pen against a flowchart. He thinks he shielded the firm's most valuable intellectual property from the marital estate. If you sue for wrongful termination, he'll tie you up in court for a decade until you're broke. Elena watched the steam rise from her tea. She knew Julian's ego was his greatest asset and his most profound weakness. He wasn't just trying to move on. He was trying to win a game where he thought he held all the pieces. He didn't realize Elena had changed the board. The ticking clock was the upcoming merger with a global conglomerate, a deal Julian needed to cement his legacy. The choice Elena faced was simple. She could take a quiet settlement and walk away with her dignity, or she could execute a maneuver that would not only reclaim her career, but would effectively hand her the keys to the kingdom Julian was trying to build. However, doing so would require her to use a piece of information she had stumbled upon while auditing their joint tax returns, something Julian thought was buried in a labyrinth of offshore accounts. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the fact that Julian had used company funds to secure the very brownstone he had kicked her out of. It was embezzlement, masked as a corporate lease, and it was the thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire tapestry. For the next 3 weeks, Elena became a ghost. She stopped answering Julian's increasingly frantic emails about the divorce settlement. She stopped posting on social media. She let him believe she was defeated. Meanwhile, she and Arthur were meticulously preparing a notice of derivative action. In the eyes of the law, because her equity hadn't legally been severed, yet due to a technicality in the morality clause's filing date, she was still a major shareholder with the right to audit the books. She wasn't just a disgruntled ex-wife. She was a ticking time bomb inside his boardroom. She watched from afar as Julian appeared on industry panels, boasting about the upcoming merger, looking every bit the billionaire in the making. He looked happy. He looked untouchable. If you've made it this far, I want to see who is really paying attention to the details of this chess match. Drop a comment with the phrase, "The architect knows the flaws." It lets me know you're following the logic of the revenge. We're about to head into the public confrontation where Julian's carefully constructed world starts to crack. So stay tuned. The real weight of the story is just ahead. The night of the Founders Gala arrived, a glittering black tie event intended to announce the merger to the world. The venue was a converted cathedral, all soaring arches and candlelight, a place Julian had chosen specifically for its sense of permanence. He was on stage, flanked by the new investors, his arm around his new partner, radiating the kind of confidence that only comes from thinking you've successfully buried your past. He was midway through a speech about integrity and the future of the industry when the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall opened. Elena didn't make a scene. She didn't shout. She simply walked to the center aisle, dressed in a suit that cost more than Julian's first car, followed by 2 men in dark suits carrying briefcases. The room went silent. The power imbalance that had defined their meeting in conference room 4B was gone. Elena didn't look at the crowd. She looked directly at Julian. She didn't need to speak loudly. The 2 men with her were process servers, but they weren't there for the divorce. They were there to serve the board of directors with a court-ordered injunction to halt the merger, pending a full forensic audit of the company's real estate holdings. Julian's face went from a triumphant tan to a sickly, ashen gray in 3 seconds. He tried to laugh it off, turning to the investors with a hell hath no fury joke, but no one laughed. The lead investor, a woman who had built her own empire from nothing, was already looking at the documents Elena had quietly placed on the front table. The hidden technical advantage Elena held wasn't just the audit. It was the fact that the morality clause Julian used to fire her was actually invalid under state law for the specific type of contract she held. Because he had fired her under a false premise, the bad lever clause that would have stripped her equity was nullified. Not only was she still a shareholder, but because of the way the Series A papers were worded, her termination triggered an immediate, accelerated vesting of all her shares. She didn't just own a piece of the company. At that moment, She owned more of it than Julian did. He had handed her the majority stake in his own company by trying to fire her. The collapse was breathtakingly fast. As the gala devolved into a sea of whispered, panicked phone calls, Julian stepped off the stage, cornering Elena in the shadows of a stone pillar. "You're destroying yourself along with me," he hissed, his voice trembling with a rage he could no longer control. "If the merger fails, your shares are worthless." Elena looked at him, and for the first time in years, she felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, just the cold satisfaction of a job well done. "I don't care about the money, Julian," she whispered back. "I care about the foundation, and yours was built on sand." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own ambition. Within 48 hours, the board forced Julian to resign to save the merger. The investors, impressed by Elena's strategic ruthlessness and her intimate knowledge of the company's inner workings, offered her the CEO position. She took it, but not before she sold the brownstone and donated the proceeds to a legal fund for women facing corporate displacement. Julian ended up in a small, rented office in a different city, trying to rebuild a reputation that was permanently stained by the audit's findings. He had tried to play the architect of her destruction, but he forgot that she was the one who knew how to read the blueprints. The fallout of the founders' gala wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing bleed out of Julian's influence. In the 48 hours following the confrontation, the Power Pair brand didn't just dissolve, it became toxic. Julian's phone, which usually buzzed with the frantic sycophancy of investors and friends, went silent. When he did manage to reach his inner circle, he was met with the cold, rehearsed scripts of their personal lawyers. Elena, meanwhile, didn't retreat to a hotel. She stayed in the office, sitting in the very chair Julian had used to fire her, watching the city lights blink on across the Chicago River. She wasn't celebrating. She was measuring the weight of the crown she had just reclaimed. The strategic revenge phase moved into its final, most clinical stage, the liquidation of Julian's pride. Arthur Vance arrived at the office on Monday morning with a stack of documents that felt like a death warrant for Julian's lifestyle. He's trying to fire sale his stake in the holding company to a private equity firm in New York, Arthur noted, dropping a heavy briefcase onto the mahogany table. He thinks if he can get liquid fast enough, he can flee the jurisdiction before the state's Financial Oversight Board freezes his assets. Elena didn't look up from her monitor. "He can't sell what he doesn't legally control, Arthur. Remind the New York firm about the lease pendants notice. If they buy a single share, they're buying a decade of litigation." This was the ticking clock Julian hadn't accounted for. In his world, money solved everything. He assumed Elena wanted a bigger divorce settlement, a few million more to go away quietly. He didn't realize she was playing for the inevitable collapse. She didn't want his money. She wanted his absence. By blocking the sale of his shares and triggering the audit, she had effectively trapped him in a cage of his own making. He was a man with a multi-million-dollar burn rate, the brownstone, the club memberships, the mistress, the bespoke suits, with an income that had just been severed at the root. By Wednesday, the morality clause Julian had drafted to humiliate Elena became his greatest nightmare. The board of directors, now terrified of being implicated in Julian's embezzlement, used that exact clause to strip him of his remaining golden parachute. They cited his public disgrace at the gala as a violation of the firm's ethical standards. It was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Julian was hoisted by the very petard he had built to destroy his wife. He was no longer the CEO. He was a liability being scrubbed from the company's history. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom or a ballroom. It happened in the lobby of their shared brownstone. Julian was there, surrounded by half-packed boxes, looking diminished. The tan had faded into a sallow gray, and his expensive shirt was wrinkled. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe without an audience. Elena walked in, not to argue, but to collect the last of her father's belongings. You really did it, Julian said, his voice hollow, echoing in the marble foyer. You burned the whole thing down just to prove a point. Elena paused, her hand on the banister she had picked out 3 summers ago. I didn't burn it down, Julian. I just took the batteries out of the smoke detector you ignored for years. She looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see the man she had loved. She saw a structural flaw. You thought you were the architect, but you were just the facade. You forgot that the foundation is the only part of a building that actually has to be real. She walked out the door, leaving him in the silence of a house that was no longer his. If you've stuck with me until the very end of this journey, I want to thank you for your patience and your focus. It's stories like these that remind us that true power isn't about who shouts the loudest, but who understands the fine print. Drop a final comment with the word reclaimed to let me know you saw Elena's victory through to the end. It's been an incredible ride sharing this narrative with you. Today, the firm is simply known as Vance & Associates. Elena sits at the helm, not as a power partner, but as a sole architect of her own destiny. The Carrington merger eventually went through, but on Elena's terms, with a board that prioritizes transparency over optics. As for Julian, he remains a cautionary tale whispered in the bars of the West Loop, a man who tried to build a kingdom on a lie and found out, too late, that the person he underestimated was the only one who knew how to keep the roof from caving in. Thank you for staying until the final brick was laid in this story. It's a reminder that intelligence and patience will always outlast ego and arrogance. If you enjoyed this journey of strategic justice, please leave a like on the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Did Julian get what he deserved, or was Elena too cold? I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe for more narratives where the underdog finds the ultimate leverage. Until next time, keep an eye on the details.